So, Lone Rider here, and I wanted to take a look at one of my favorite old school bikes, if you will, except it's not really that old school. This is from the early 2000s, and it is it's a bit of a mystery, right? This was at my friend's bike shop way back in I was 2010, 2011, something like that, when I got it. And it was several years old by then. It had been there for a while. He had gotten it from somebody basically new and was trying to sell it, and it just didn't move. And I understand why. It was kind of a novelty thing. The bike brand, according to, the stickers have all pretty much been removed except for the one here. But it is apparently an Eclipse, which, if you know anything about junk bikes, that's a name that's often seen on department store offerings, that sort of thing. That's not what this is. This is a decent quality mountain bike, and the general belief is that the frames were made by Da Vinci. It was apparently the house brand of a bike shop or sports outfitter in Canada at the time. And there have been, some suspicions about who made the frames. Some people say it was the same factory that built them for Specialized. Some people say it was Da Vinci. I'm not entirely sure, but the bike rides really nice. It's definitely unique, and its build is also kind of unique because this originally started as a triple with a full complement of gears in the back as well, and it's now a home-built one-by. I replaced the cranks. I have my own pedals on here. There's these Sun Ringles. You have a homemade bash guard. The bash guard actually started life as a gear, and I just cut the teeth off. You'll notice the derailleur is a Diore LX, as is the remaining shifter. And I think this is 9-speed. Let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yep, 9-speed. I remembered it being, it was like the first bike I ever got with 9-speed. And I remembered, wait, was it 9-speed? Let me think. Yeah, it's 9-speed. You also have a somewhat oversized seat post. The default modern seat post for a long time was, there's never really been a standard. There've always been variety in seat post sizes. Basically, they jump from size to size in tenths of a millimeter or two-tenths of a millimeter. So you'll have 26.2, 26.4, 26.8, 26.6, 27.0, etc. The sort of normal seat post for a long time was 27.2. I don't know why. It was just a very common size. And then you started to see oversized seat posts, or what we began to call oversized because they were bigger than 27.2. And this is one of those. I don't remember the exact size in metric, but it's definitely larger. And you've got a mixture of, interesting parts on here. The fork is original. And the brakes are original, and the rear shifter is original, but pretty much everything else, and the headset, of course, but pretty much everything else has been swapped. These are my stem, my bars, my spacers. The rims, I think, are original, but the skewers are not. This has titanium skewers on the wheels. The tires, I don't know. I think those are replacements. I think those came from something else, because those are Bontrager Jones, and the bike did not come with Bontrager tires. My own seat I put on this WTB Rocket. I have 2 of these. I'd have more if they weren't so expensive. When I got this, the seat was fairly inexpensive, and now they've gone up in price, so I'm probably not going to be getting any more of those. It's a shame because they ride really nice. But basically this was a standard setup with a triple and a 9-speed, and I turned it into a one-by, and it's a one-by that actually works on hilly terrain. I've ridden this in Lewis Morris. I rode it in Watchung back when we could ride there. There was a period when we were working for Bike Access where they took the signs down. I rode it there. Of course, Lewis Morris is very similar terrain, very hilly, lots of up and downs, a little bit of rocks and roots. And this thing handled that with aplomb. Now, what's interesting about this is most dedicated one-by drivetrains that are mass-produced now have really, really huge rear gears. The idea is to essentially do the same thing as a compact double and duplicate the triple, but with only a single front chainring. You have to have more range in the back. I managed to use pretty much a standard cog set for this, which I think is very interesting because it doesn't look all that big, but it works. And like I said, it works on hilly terrain. The fork, it's actually kind of funny. This is one of those RST spring forks. There's an RST Kappa TL, and it's like a spring fork with bumpers. It's old school. And you have some adjustability on these top mounts, but not much. A lot of people look at something like this and they go, ugh, that's just totally old-fashioned. There's no, an air fork's going to be lighter, offer you more adjustability, etc. I'm actually happy with the way this handles. Obviously, it'd be nice if it had a nicer fork, but it came with this. The fork's original. It works. Again, the bike might be a little better balanced if it had a lighter shock in the front. Something like even something old school like the Manitou R7 I have on my single speed. But, the way I have it set up, everything is just so. What's interesting is that the ride position and the ride quality are actually, aluminum bikes get a lot of bad rap. I think a lot of that has to do with, especially in the very beginning, you had a lot of aluminum frames. The oversized Cannondales were notorious for this. That gave a very harsh ride. This bike, strangely enough, despite the squared off chain and seat stays and the oversized tubes, this bike actually gives a very comfortable ride. It literally, it has the stiffness of steel. I should say it has the stiffness of aluminum, but it doesn't have the comfort trade-off of aluminum. It doesn't have a harsh ride. It has a stiff ride, and it has it's nimble, but it doesn't ride very stiff. Now, part of that, of course, is due to setup. If you have your ride position just right, the way I have this set up, bars are a little higher in the seat, but not much, and my position over the pedals and where I end up is pretty good. You'll notice this has flat bars. I'm old school. I like the aesthetic of flat bars. When I can have them, I have them. Some bikes you really need risers, but another cool thing about flat bars, of course, is it allows you to use bar ends. These are homemade stubbies. They started out as longer bar ends. I cut them down and then capped them off, and they could be stubbier. They give you almost a full hand position. Your last three fingers basically fit on there. I have another bike that has even stubbier ones that are only about that long. I like bar ends, but I don't really like the idea of having long ones. There's a risk of them catching on things and so forth. Part of me thinks that risk is overblown. Especially, you'll notice this bike doesn't have particularly wide bars either. I do like the being able to have a variety of hand positions. And as a geared bike, but a bike that only has one set of gears, it's a single ring in the front. You're gonna probably have to be standing on the pedals and whatnot. So these things come in handy. And by the way, for those who don't understand bar ends, I've seen a lot of people who put bar ends on their bikes, and they seem to think the bar ends are there so that you can hold them like joysticks. They have the bar ends pointed straight up at the sky like a giant middle finger in the face of ergonomics. No. The bar ends are intended to be mounted at an angle facing forward, not straight up in the air, okay, or backwards even. If they're straight up in the air or backwards, you've got a problem. All right, you need to get your bike looked at. Something's wrong with it. They should be facing like this or like this or like this. Some people have them level. I prefer them to be tilted slightly up, but the point is they should be pointing forward, not up in the air. Anyway, headset rounds us out. This is a Ritchie SCSI Logic Pro. And then, the rest of the parts are the Diore LX. Ori grips, swear by these, like them. And these, I don't know what are these, Hope? Yeah, these are Hope anodized bar caps. Like I said, mismatched titanium skewers. The bike fills an interesting niche for me. This is a bike that was still a few years in the future at the time I started riding, which was the mid-90s. When I think of old school, I think of either stuff that was around when I first started riding or a little bit before. So mid to early 1990s or mid to late 1980s stuff. And I think when a lot of people think of old school bikes, that's really what they think of. They think of the stuff that was old, or the stuff that was either old when they started or the stuff that was new when they started but is now really old. For me, it's kind of funny. This bike would now be considered old school, but when I got it, it was only a few years old and it had never been ridden. And of course, like I said, I completely tore it apart and rebuilt it the way I wanted. But the thing about this bike is that it fits an interesting niche in that it's not an old school bike. It's mid school, I guess. It's like it's vintage, but it's not old, if you know what I'm saying. And there's a nice aspect to that. Just like with my Airborne single speed, you're talking about a bike that has compatibility with a lot of modern parts and a lot of modern forks. You've got a frame that can accommodate disc brakes. The fork can accommodate disc brakes. You can fit a contemporary steerer tube on here. You're not going to be able to fit one that has a tapered steerer tube, with the two different size bearing races. But a standard, 1 1/8 threaded headset, you'll be able to fit that on here. A threadless headset, I should say, because that's what this has. And you can still get seat posts in this size. The bottom bracket is a standard. It's not anything weird or unusual. This bike could be outfitted with virtually everything you choose to put on it today, with the possible exception of through axles. And if you're like me and you're into older bikes, I know it's very tempting to sometimes go for the oldest and most esoteric, well, I want, the very first mountain bike. I want a, like 1981 Specialized Stump Jumper or something. Or even more esoteric, like I want a vintage Klein from the late 80s, or an early Cunningham, something like that. Fat Chance. I had a Fat Chance. I wish I still had it. I actually sold it back to the guy I got it from because I rarely rode it. At first I rode it all the time, and then I just kept looking at it like, this is too beautiful to risk mucking up, and I just never rode it. And so the 1988 Fat Chance went back to its, I won't say its original owner because he was probably its second owner, but went back to the guy who had it before me. Part of me wishes I still had that bike. But anyway, it can be tempting to just go out and get the, like the Grail bike that you've dreamed of. That was, the thing that was brand new when you were a kid and you could never afford. And I had an interesting experience with that as far as dual suspension goes. The Grail bike for me was a Specialized FSR back in the 90s. I think for a lot of people it was, in terms of dual suspension. Rigid, it's hard to say. A lot of the steel bikes I thought were completely badass, but I also had a soft spot for Cannondales, and, well, all I'm going to say is Killer V. If you know vintage Cannondales, that's all you need to hear. Killer V. That was my holy grail bike. Anyway, but in terms of dual suspension, the holy grail was the FSR, and I actually had a chance to get my hands on an all-mountain later version of an FSR some years ago. And I really liked it, and it rode nice, and it was even red and black, which are the colors of the local bike shop. I mean, I thought it was awesome. And then I noticed a lot of pedal strike. At one point, one of my feet was practically like bent around the pedal from hitting the root, and I was like, oh, it's not Well, it turned out it was supposed to, I thought I messed it up, putting the wrong fork on. I got it as a frame only. Turned out it was supposed to have a low bottom bracket. And long story short, I looked at other dual suspension bikes. When I got a chance, I bought a used Kona Dog, and that rides way better than the Specialized FSR ever did. It doesn't have the aesthetic that I really thought was awesome and the rep that I really thought was awesome when I was a kid. But I'm not a kid anymore, and I know better now. And I'm kind of going by not just what looks cool, but what has a functional aesthetic, right? I mean, if it looks really cool, but it doesn't work for your situation, then what's the point? Now that said, the particular FSR I had was a sort of all mountain or enduro version. A standard FSR might actually have had a slightly higher bottom bracket. I don't know. If I do get a chance to test ride a standard one that's vintage, I definitely will take that shot. But for now, you know, the holy grail for me of dual suspension bikes, I already own it. And it's the bike that when I was a kid, I was never interested in because I thought they were ugly as sin. And everybody was dumping all the press on the FSR. And, you know, you're young and stupid and 16 years old and you're reading Mountain Bike Magazine and you're, you know, getting sold along with what everybody else is getting sold along with. You know, you need this. This is the best. Not really, dude. That doesn't work for you. That said, you know, stuff that you grew up thinking would be awesome, it's really hard to take a step back and be like, actually, it's not really awesome. That was just all marketing, or maybe it was awesome, but not for my situation. So like I said, if I had a chance to test ride a different one, I probably would. But what I ended up with was a very different full suspension bike, and it rides 10 times better than the FSR I had, and I'm happy with it. But back to this, yeah, when I was a kid, because aluminum mountain bikes were coming into their own in my early teenage years, I did have an aesthetic appreciation for bikes like this. Bikes like the Cannondale, bikes like the Climb, you know. And it is kind of funny, years later, to find myself with one that's sort of old school, but new enough that I can put modern parts on it, that I can replace or upgrade anything I want to replace or upgrade, and that the bike can keep running into the foreseeable future. Whereas, you know, a really vintage bike, a really old school bike, something with, let's say, a 1-inch headset, if you tweak that fork or you want to switch your fork, good luck. You know, there's used stuff on the market. You might have one custom put together for you, but it's not going to be as easy, right? There's pretty much anything can be done. It's usually just a question of time and money and effort, and is it worth it to you? And the question for me, of course, would be, well, you know, you get a bike secondhand, fairly cheap, you fix it up, and then you realize it's going to cost you 3 times what it's worth to replace the fork. It's like, is it worth it? Whereas something like this, because it's old, but it's not really old school, it's, you know, it sort of fits in that middle period between what's traditionally seen as old school mountain bikes and, you know, contemporary stuff. It's new enough that basically everything on this can be maintained and can take current parts. So, you know, if you're one of those people who's into older bikes like I am, I mean, I have, you know, modern bikes. I have, you know, relatively new stuff, but most of my stuff is older. And, you know, if you are one of those people who's into older bikes, consider looking at something like this. The advantages are, you know, one, it's probably not going to be as expensive as a true old school bike. A true, you know, grail bike for many people is going to command a high price because there's just a lot of people who are into that stuff. There's a lot of people who love the vintage Climbs, the vintage Cannondales, the, you know, the vintage Gary Fishers and stump jumpers and all that stuff. Many of these things at this point are collectible, and Fat Chance is another one. I mean, you know, you end up paying, you know, $1,000 or more for what's a rigid steel bike with 40-year-old technology. And they're awesome bikes, don't get me wrong, but it's kind of limited what you can do with it these days. Especially if you're older like me. And yeah, I can ride a rigid bike off-road, and I've done it, but it's really only feasible if you have really wide, cushy tires. And because these bikes are something like a 1988, you know, Fat Chance is really old, the tire clearance is only going to go so far. So, you know, it's like, and to be honest, if you have a bike like that, which is essentially a museum piece, like how hard are you going to want to thrash it, right? Which is why I sold mine back to the person I got it from, because I just couldn't bear to think of mucking it up, you know. Whereas something like this, it's not going to be so dear financially to purchase because it's a little newer, so it's not going to have quite the collectability status. There's going to be a lot more compatibility with current parts or parts that are currently available or in stock somewhere, and you're basically going to be able to keep it running for the foreseeable future. It's also going to, need less parts upgrades. So if you buy something that's 40 years old, you're probably going to have to go through, all the consumable parts, tires, grips, maybe even the seat are going to basically be, dry rotted or deteriorated or cracked or whatever. Not necessarily in every case, but as a general rule, yeah, you're going to have to replace cables, maybe cable housings, tires, tubes, rim strips. The grips will probably be like a gooey mess and or dry and cracked. Your seat may be torn or scuffed or rotted away, stuff like that. Whereas if you have a bike that's not quite so old, again, the stuff you have to replace is less. And yeah, you might want to tweak it and maybe even rebuild it to customize it for a different setup like I did. But the point is you'll be able to actually get it out on the trail or the road, depending on how you're riding and what you're riding, sooner. I mean, when I got this, I started pretty much riding it as is once I set it up to fit me. And then I just sort of tweaked the part spec as I went along. And that's another thing that's kind of cool about a bike like this is that is part of the process. It's kind of like a journey. You get the bike, and then you start setting it up the way you want it. And then because there is an availability of parts, you can drop by your bike shop one day, buy a seat post, buy a set of handlebars, whatever. They probably won't have to special order it for you. Or if you're like me and you have a lot of junk lying around your house, hell, you may have a bar of the right clamp diameter and length and whatnot. Again, I mean, I made my own bash guard. I made my own, stubby bar ends, stuff like that. So, yeah, I don't rightly know exactly the full history of this. Like I said, Eclipse, it was a house brand in Canada. Not entirely sure who made the bike. People say it was made in Canada, which again has prompted questions of are they essentially rebadged Da Vinci frames? Which is for a long time what I've thought. I'm not entirely sure. Certainly it rides really, really nice. I mean, the welds aren't all that clean. They're kind of industrial looking welds. I think they could have filed those down a little bit. But the point is, they're good welds. They're sturdy. There's no gaps or anything. It's just they have a very pronounced bead. Maybe that's the style. I don't know. But the shape of the tubing and how everything fits and the fittings, and it's just the overall ride quality. Like I said, you have the stiffness and the speed of an aluminum bike, especially given the short wheelbase and the squared off stays, but it rides comfortable. It doesn't ride like a stereotypical aluminum bike. So there you go. And like I said, if you're interested in older bikes like I am, but you don't necessarily want to limit yourself too much by using really old tech that can't be upgraded or necessarily maintained, or that it would be hard to get parts for, or whatever. A bike from this era, say late 90s through early 2000s, is definitely something to think about. It's old enough you can get your vintage mountain bike Jones on, but at the same time, it's a little more practical because it is new enough that pretty much everything from headset to rear hub is compatible with what's currently on the market. Again, with the possible exception of through axles. So, yeah, there you go. Some bit about this bike here, what I call the Yellow Monster. And yeah, it's my favorite, not quite old school mountain bike. There you go. Well, rider out.